Sometimes the only way to save yourself is to trust a complete stranger. Sometimes a single letter can change a life forever. For Fiona Sterling, it was both. For 8 long years, she'd been a ghost in her own home, haunted by a mother whose grief had turned to poison. Every dream she ever had was crushed, every hope met with a cruel word. In the bitter cold of an 1880s Montana winter, at 28 years old, Fiona was running out of time. She was withering away, a flower dying in the shade. Then, a traveling preacher mentioned a cowboy looking for a wife. A man she'd never met. A name whispered on the wind: Garrett Webb. His letters were like water in a desert, promising a kindness she'd nearly forgotten existed. Fiona saw her one and only chance to escape. She said yes. She agreed to marry a shadow, a man whose hands she'd never held. Garrett was supposed to be a simple cowboy, a man with rough hands and worn boots, building a small life on a patch of dirt. But that wasn't the truth, not even close. He was hiding a secret so massive it could swallow the whole territory. He was the heir to one of the biggest cattle empires in Montana. Fiona thought she was marrying a poor rancher to escape a tyrant. She had no idea she was about to become one of the wealthiest women in the West. But secrets have a way of coming out, and her mother had a way of destroying everything. The winter wind was a razor, slicing through the thin walls of the Sterling homestead. It was a sound Fiona knew better than her own heartbeat. For 3 months, the cold had been a physical presence, a guest that wouldn't leave. She knelt by the fireplace, her father's old wool coat pulled tight, coaxing the last bit of warmth from a few dying embers. Her hands were a road map of her life. Calloused, scarred, the hands of a woman who worked twice as hard for half the recognition. Her green eyes held a weariness that didn't belong to a woman of 28. It was the weariness of a prisoner. Fiona, where is my morning tea? The voice was a whip crack. It cut through the quiet and landed squarely on Fiona's shoulders, making her flinch. Her mother, Constance Sterling, ruled this house from her bed, a throne of disappointment and faded pillows. You know I can't start my day without it, and here you are, dawdling by that useless fire. Fiona closed her eyes, just for a second. She breathed in, searching for the patience her father had taught her. Kindness is a choice, he used to say, his voice a warm memory against the cold reality of her life. But it was getting harder and harder to choose kindness when all she ever received was cruelty. Coming, mother, she called out. Her own voice sounded thin, worn out, just like her brown dress. The dress was more patches than original fabric, a quilt of poverty she wore every single day. Her father had said dignity wasn't in what you wore, but how you carried yourself. She tried to remember that. She really did. But her mother's words made her feel smaller than dust. The kitchen smelled of yesterday's failure, beans and cornbread. Barely enough for 2, but she'd given her mother the larger share, as always. I'm not hungry, she'd lied, her stomach cramping into a tight knot of emptiness. Now she spooned tea leaves into the pot, leaves she'd already used twice. How much longer could they last? How much longer could she last? It had been 8 years, 8 years since the spring storm that had thrown her father from his horse, breaking his neck and shattering their world. Thomas Sterling had been the heart of their family. He was the wall that stood between Fiona's gentle spirit and her mother's sharp tongue. He'd taught her to read from his old Bible, filling her head with stories of faraway places, of possibilities beyond their struggling patch of land. When he died, something in Constance died too. But grief didn't soften her. It sharpened her. It turned her into a weapon she aimed at her daughter every single day. This tea tastes like dishwater, Constance spat as Fiona entered the dim bedroom. Her mother's face, once handsome, was now a mask of permanent disapproval. Can't you do anything right? Your father would be ashamed to see how useless you've become. The words were arrows, and they always found their mark. Fiona had learned to take the hit without showing the wound, but inside, she was bleeding. The constant attacks had worn grooves in her soul. "I'll brew a fresh pot," she offered, knowing it was an empty promise. They both knew the tea tin was nearly empty. "Don't bother. Nothing you do turns out right anyway." Constance turned her face to the wall, dismissed. "Check the chicken coop. Those lazy birds probably haven't laid anything useful, just like everything else on this cursed place." Fiona escaped outside, gulping the frigid air like a drowning woman. The endless gray sky was a perfect mirror of her mood. Snow crunched under her boots as she walked to the small coop her father had built in better days. 2 eggs. That was all. Barely enough for one person. Not enough for 2. As she tucked the eggs into her apron, she let herself remember her father finding silver linings in the darkest storms. "The hard winters just make the spring wildflowers more beautiful, Fee," he'd say. Those dreams felt like they belonged to someone else now. The cattle were gone, sold off one by one. The land felt less like a promise and more like a prison. Then she heard it. The sound of approaching horses. It was a sound so rare it made her heart jump. A familiar figure rode through the gray morning. Reverend Samuel Morrison. For nearly 20 years, he'd been a lifeline for the isolated families in the territory, bringing news, mail, and a little bit of hope. His visits were the only bright spot in her world. "Miss Fiona," he called, his weathered face breaking into a warm smile. His kind blue eyes seemed to see right through the walls she'd built around herself. "I hope this cold snap is treating you and your mother well." "As well as can be expected, Reverend," she replied, the simple kindness in his voice making her throat feel tight. The Reverend reached into his saddlebags. "Actually, I have something rather unusual today. A letter addressed to you specifically." He handed her an envelope. The paper was thick, expensive. Her name was written in a strong, masculine hand. She stared at it. A letter? For her? "I don't understand. Who would be writing to me?" "A young man from over in Millfield," the Reverend explained, his eyes twinkling. "Garrett Webb. He's been corresponding with me about finding a wife. Someone who values character over circumstances. I may have mentioned I knew a fine young woman who embodied those very qualities." Fiona's heart started to pound. A slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. Garrett Webb. The paper felt warm in her cold hands. It felt like possibility. "You told him about me?" "I told him about a young woman of faith and character who had faced hardship with grace," the Reverend said gently. "A woman who deserved a chance at happiness with a man who would appreciate her true worth." Before she could process the words, her mother's voice sliced through the air. "Fiona! Who's out there? You know I don't like visitors." The Reverend tipped his hat. "I should pay my respects. But Fiona, read that letter when you have a quiet moment. Sometimes the Lord opens doors we didn't even know we were looking for." As they walked toward the house, Fiona clutched the letter to her chest. It felt like a secret. It felt like a key that might unlock the door to her prison. For the first time in a very long time, she felt a flicker of something she had almost forgotten. Hope. After the Reverend left, Fiona waited. She waited until her mother was settled for her afternoon nap, her snores filling the small, suffocating house. She retreated to her sanctuary, a small alcove where her father's Bible and a few of his things were kept. It was the only place in the house that didn't feel contaminated by her mother's bitterness. With trembling fingers, she broke the seal. The handwriting inside was strong, clear. The words were simple, but they landed on her heart like rain on parched earth. "Dear Miss Sterling," it began. "Reverend Morrison has spoken of you with such respect that I find myself hoping you might correspond with a stranger. I am a rancher in Millfield, working to build something lasting. I am 29 years old, a man of faith who believes a life shared with the right partner is the greatest blessing. I seek not a housekeeper, but a true companion who understands that real wealth lies in loyalty, kindness, and the strength to face life's challenges together. If you are willing to write back, I would consider it a privilege to learn more about the woman the Reverend describes as having a spirit that shines even in difficult circumstances. Respectfully yours, Garrett Webb. She read it 3 times. A true companion. Not a servant, not a possession, a partner. The words were a balm to her wounded spirit. This man, this Garrett Webb, seemed to value the very things her mother had tried to crush out of her. For the first time in 8 years, Fiona allowed herself to imagine a different life. A life where her days were filled with purpose instead of pain. As the wind howled outside, she pressed the letter to her heart and dared to dream of spring. 3 weeks crawled by. In that time, Fiona read Garrett's letter until the paper was soft and the creases were worn thin. She wrote her reply 100 times in her head, finally putting pen to paper with a hand that shook. She wrote of her love for the land, her faith, and her hope for companionship. She was careful. She didn't reveal the true depth of her misery. She didn't want to sound like a victim. She wanted to sound like a survivor. When she saw Reverend Morrison riding through the morning mist, her heart hammered against her ribs. In his saddlebags was her future. Or her failure. "Miss Fiona," he called, and there was a barely contained excitement in his smile. "I believe I have something that will interest you greatly." He handed her another envelope. This one was thicker, heavier. "Mr. Webb asked me to tell you that your letter moved him deeply," the Reverend said quietly, glancing toward the house. "He said it revealed a spirit that shines with exactly the kind of light he's been hoping to find." She tucked the letter away, her mother's suspicious eyes making her feel like a thief. Constance had an almost supernatural ability to sniff out any hint of joy and extinguish it. Later, hidden in the cold silence of the barn, she opened it. The letter was longer, filled with questions about her dreams, with stories of his life. But it was the last paragraph that made the world stop. "Miss Sterling, I find myself in the unusual position of feeling I have come to know your heart through your words. If you are willing, I would ask for your hand in marriage. I know this seems sudden, but I have learned that the heart recognizes truth when it finds it. I can offer you a home, protection, and a partnership built on mutual respect. The Reverend has agreed to perform the ceremony if you consent. I await your answer with hope. Yours in earnest affection, Garrett Webb." Marriage. To a man she'd never seen. A man who offered her everything she'd ever secretly wished for. The letter trembled in her hands. This was it. This was the key. The escape. But as she walked back toward the house, the cold wave of reality crashed over her. How could she? What did she have to offer? She was a 28-year-old spinster with calloused hands and a spirit worn thin by years of abuse. What if he met her and was disappointed? What if he discovered she was nothing special at all? "Where have you been?" Her mother's voice was sharp, suspicious. Constance stood by the window, her face a mask of accusation. "You've been acting strange, secretive. I don't like it." "I was checking on the animals, Mother," Fiona lied, the letter burning a hole in her apron pocket. "Don't lie to me, girl. I saw you with that meddlesome preacher. What nonsense has he been filling your head with this time?" Constance moved closer, her eyes narrowing. "You've got that look again, like you're thinking thoughts above your station." Fiona's cheeks flushed. "I was just being polite." "Kind." Her mother spat the word. "Kindness is for the weak. Your father was kind, and look where it got him. Dead in a ditch with nothing to show for it but debt and disappointment." The words were a physical blow. Her father had been a good man. A kind man. He deserved better than this bitter memory. "Father was a good man," Fiona said, her voice quiet but firm. "A good man?" Constance mocked. Good men don't abandon their families. Your father filled your head with romantic nonsense, and look at you. 28 years old and completely alone, dependent on me. Each word was a perfectly aimed dart. But this time, something was different. Instead of crumbling, Fiona felt a cold anger rise within her. An anger that had been dormant for 8 long years. Maybe if you hadn't driven away every man who ever showed interest in me, I might have had a chance at marriage, she said, the words escaping before she could stop them. The silence that followed was heavy, dangerous. Her mother's face twisted in on itself, cycling through shock, then fury, then a rage so cold it terrified Fiona. How dare you? Constance whispered, her voice deadly. I protected you. I protected you from making the same mistake I did. What mistake? Fiona breathed, a part of her not wanting to know. Marrying your father, Constance said, the words dripping with venom. Believing in love and pretty lies. I was beautiful once. I could have had anyone. But I chose him. And I spent my life watching him fail while I grew old and poor. The confession hung between them, a poison cloud. For the first time, Fiona saw her mother clearly. A woman so consumed by her own regret that she had to destroy her daughter's happiness too. So you decided to make sure I would be just as miserable as you are, Fiona said, the truth of it hitting her like a physical blow. That's when her mother's hand moved. It was a blur of motion, a crack of sound that echoed in the small kitchen. Fiona's cheek exploded with pain. You ungrateful fool, Constance hissed. Everything I've done has been to protect you. You wouldn't survive a day without me. Fiona touched her stinging cheek. The fear was still there, a cold knot in her stomach, but it was being drowned out by something else, a desperate, burning need to be free. Maybe I should find out if that's true, she said, her voice shaking but clear. Her mother stared at her, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. For the first time, Constance seemed to realize that the rules of their cruel game had just changed. Fiona stood up straight, meeting her mother's furious gaze. Maybe it's time I found out if I can survive without you. The words were a declaration of war. There was no going back. She had drawn a line in the sand. Constance's face hardened into a mask of cold fury. You think you have choices? Look around you, girl. This is all you have, all you will ever have. But as her mother stormed out, leaving Fiona with her burning cheek and a heart that was beating like a war drum, she knew her mother was wrong. Garrett Webb's letter was a warm promise against her chest, a promise of a different life. For the first time in 8 years, Fiona Sterling believed she might actually have a choice, and she was going to take it. That night, sleep was impossible. The wind howled, a symphony for the storm raging inside her. The confrontation with her mother had changed something. It had broken the chains of fear that had held her captive for so long. When dawn broke, gray and cold, Fiona rose with a new resolve. She was going to say yes. She was going to marry Garrett Webb. The thought was both terrifying and exhilarating. She knew nothing about him really, only what his kind letters revealed. But even the worst unknown was better than the misery she knew. It had to be. While her mother slept, Fiona wrote the letter that would seal her fate. Dear Mr. Webb, your proposal has given me hope that I had almost forgotten how to feel. Yes, I will marry you. I pray that we might find in each other the partnership and companionship that makes life's struggles bearable. I await word of when and where we might meet to begin our life together. Fiona Sterling. She sealed the letter, her heart pounding. When Reverend Morrison arrived 3 days later, she was ready. You've made your decision, he said, seeing the answer in her eyes before she even spoke. I have, she said, her voice surprisingly steady. Courage isn't the absence of fear, Miss Fiona. the Reverend said with a gentle smile. It's doing what's right, despite the fear. They made the arrangements in hushed tones. They would meet at the church in Millfield, a 2-day ride away. The wedding would be simple, and it would have to be a secret. Constance would never let her go willingly. A confrontation would be dangerous. I hate the secrecy, Fiona admitted. It feels like a betrayal. Sometimes we have to choose between loyalty to those who would harm us and loyalty to the person God created us to be, the Reverend replied. The week that followed was the longest of her life. She went about her daily chores, a perfect picture of obedience, while secretly planning her escape. She mended her one good dress, the blue wool that had belonged to her mother. She packed her few treasures, her father's Bible, a small collection of pressed wildflowers, and the wedding ring that had been her mother's, a ring she'd never worn. Constance watched her like a hawk, her eyes sharp with suspicion. "You're humming," she said one morning. "I haven't heard you hum in years. What's gotten into you?" "Nothing, Mother," Fiona lied, forcing a weary tone. "Just trying to make the best of another day." But inside, she was humming. She was humming because, for the first time, she could see the horizon. The night before she was to leave, she lay in her narrow bed, listening to her mother's restless stirring. A part of her wanted to explain, to try one last time to make her understand. But she knew it was pointless. Her mother didn't want her to be happy. She wanted her to be present. She wanted her to be miserable. Before the sun rose, Fiona slipped out of the house like a shadow. She had already hidden her small bundle of belongings in the barn. She left a letter on the kitchen table, an explanation she knew her mother would never accept. She also left a pile of firewood and enough food to last for weeks. It was all she could do to quiet the guilt in her heart. As she led their old mare, Patience, away from the homestead, she felt the weight of 8 years lift from her shoulders. The air was crisp and clean. It smelled like freedom. She didn't look back. Looking back was a luxury she couldn't afford. Fear was a predator, and she couldn't let it catch her. Not now. The sun climbed higher, and with every step the old mare took, Fiona felt herself moving further from the past and closer to an unknown future. For the first time in her life, she was heading towards something, not just running away. And that felt like the most beautiful, terrifying thing in the world. The journey to Millfield was like stepping into a new world. The land was richer here, greener. The homestead she passed looked prosperous, cared for. Everything seemed more vibrant, as if choosing her own path had sharpened her senses. She arrived in Millfield at sunset on the second day, her body aching, her nerves stretched thin. The town was bigger than she'd expected, a bustling hub of activity. The church steeple rose against a darkening sky, a beacon of hope. Reverend Morrison had arranged for her to stay at a boarding house run by a kindly widow, Mrs. Fletcher, who asked no questions. "Tomorrow's a big day for you," Mrs. Fletcher said with a knowing smile. "I'm more nervous than I expected," Fiona confessed. "That's natural, dear," the woman said, patting her shoulder. "Marriage is always a leap of faith, but Reverend Morrison speaks very highly of Mr. Webb, and that's recommendation enough for most folks around here." That night, sleep didn't come easy. She lay in the unfamiliar bed, listening to the sounds of the town, and wondered if Garrett Webb was lying awake too. Was he having second thoughts? Was he as terrified as she was? Morning arrived, gray and cold, with a light dusting of snow. Fiona dressed in her blue wool dress, her hands shaking slightly. At the church, Reverend Morrison was waiting. "Mr. Webb isn't here yet," he said, his own nervousness showing. "But I expect him any moment. How are you feeling, my dear?" "Terrified," she admitted with a shaky laugh. "But determined." "That's exactly how you should feel," he replied. Then the church door opened, and Fiona's heart stopped. The man who walked in was nothing like the weathered, work-worn rancher she had imagined. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched with silver at the temples. He moved with an easy confidence that spoke of education, of a life lived beyond hard labor. His clothes were simple but well made, his boots of a quality she had never seen before. But it was his eyes that held her. They were a deep, kind brown, crinkled at the corners with laugh lines. When those eyes met hers, she saw surprise, then relief, and then something that looked like genuine warmth. "Miss Sterling," he said, and his voice was exactly as she'd imagined. Warm, steady. "I'm Garrett Webb. You're even more beautiful than I dared to hope." A blush crept up her neck. No one had ever spoken to her like that. "Mr. Webb," she managed. He stepped closer, and she caught the scent of good leather and expensive soap. Everything about him whispered of a prosperity far beyond that of a simple rancher. But she pushed the thought away. Maybe he was just more successful than she'd assumed. "Are you ready?" Reverend Morrison asked gently. Fiona looked into Garrett Webb's kind eyes and saw an uncertain but hopeful future waiting for her. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and strong. "I'm ready." The ceremony was simple, beautiful. As Garrett slipped a plain gold band onto her finger, she felt like she was putting on a new life. He leaned down and kissed her, a gentle, brief touch that sent a jolt through her she hadn't expected. "Mrs. Webb," he said quietly, and the sound of her new name was the sweetest music she had ever heard. As they prepared to leave for his ranch, she noticed other things. His horse was a magnificent stallion, a thoroughbred. The wagon he'd brought was new, well made. And the way the townspeople treated him, it wasn't just respect, it was deference. "You're well regarded here," she said as they rode out of town. "I try to be a good neighbor," he replied, but there was a weariness in his voice that hinted at something more. The journey to his ranch took them through even more beautiful country. The land was lush, the fences were strong, the cattle were fat and healthy. This was not the land of a struggling rancher. When they crested a final hill, Fiona gasped. Spread out below them wasn't a modest homestead. It was a sprawling operation. The main house was a two-story structure of stone and timber, with a wide porch and sparkling windows. Barns, corrals, and bunkhouses dotted the landscape. It was a small town unto itself. "It's beautiful," she whispered, the word feeling small and inadequate. "It's home," Garrett said, but she heard the nervousness in his voice. "I hope you'll come to feel the same way." As they drew closer, men came out to greet them. Not rough cowboys, but competent, professional-looking men. "Welcome home, boss," said a grizzled older man. "And welcome to you, ma'am. I'm Buck Henderson, the foreman. We're all pleased to have a lady grace the place at last." "Boss." The word hung in the air. This wasn't just a ranch. It was an enterprise, and Garrett Webb wasn't just another cowboy. He was in charge. The inside of the house was even more stunning. Rich wood, comfortable furniture, a fireplace big enough to stand in. It was clean, well maintained, but it lacked a woman's touch. It felt like a house waiting to be made a home. He showed her to a large, airy bedroom on the second floor. "This will be your room," he said, giving her space, giving her time. She appreciated the gesture more than he could know. "It's much nicer than anything I'm used to," she said, running a hand over a beautiful handmade quilt. "You deserve nice things, Fiona," he said simply. "You deserve a lot more than you've been given, I think." The simple, perceptive words made tears sting her eyes. When was the last time anyone had said she deserved anything good? That evening, as they shared their first meal, she studied the man she had married. He was educated, well-spoken. He asked her about books and music, treating her opinions as if they truly mattered. But the mysteries remained. The quality of everything around them, the deference of his men, the sheer scale of the ranch. It all pointed to a story he wasn't telling. Later, as she prepared for bed, she unwrapped a small wedding gift from Mrs. Fletcher, a set of beautifully embroidered pillowcases. She pressed the soft fabric to her cheek and allowed herself to hope. Whatever secrets Garrett Webb was keeping, he had shown her nothing but kindness and respect. And for now, after a lifetime of the opposite, that was more than enough. The weeks that followed were like a dream. Fiona found a rhythm in this new life, a purpose she had never known. She cooked meals that were praised, tended a garden that flourished, and slowly, piece by piece, turned the grand house into a warm home. Her efforts were noticed, appreciated, valued. Garrett was everything his letters had promised, and more. He was patient, kind, and genuinely interested in her. They would talk for hours by the fire each evening, two strangers slowly, carefully becoming friends, becoming partners. But the dream had shadows. The mysteries surrounding her husband didn't go away. They multiplied. It started with small things. The coffee was imported. The books on his shelves were rare and expensive. His clothes, though practical, were tailored from fine fabrics. Then there were the visitors. Well-dressed men from Helena and beyond, arriving in carriages, speaking to Garrett with a respect reserved for men of great power. They talked of banks, of investments, of sums of money that made her head spin. And their conversations always stopped the moment she entered the room. "Who was that gentleman yesterday?" she asked one morning. The man had worn a suit finer than any she had ever seen. "Marcus Hartley, from the Territorial Bank," Garrett answered, not quite meeting her eye. "Just routine business about a loan." But it didn't feel routine. Bank officials didn't travel for 2 days for a routine loan, and they certainly didn't speak to a simple rancher with such deference. Even the ranch hands held clues. They were loyal, not just to Garrett, but to his family. "Your husband's father was a good man," Buck, the foreman, told her one day. "Built this place up from nothing. Garrett's got the same character, if you don't mind me saying so, ma'am." "How long has the family owned this land?" she asked, trying to sound casual. Buck's eyes became guarded. "Oh, must be going on 30 years now. Old Mr. Webb had an eye for good land. Built quite an operation before he passed." Quite an operation. That was an understatement. This was an empire. One evening, while Garrett was out checking on a newborn calf, she was tidying his downstairs study. Papers were spread across his desk. She didn't mean to pry, but the numbers leaped out at her. Bank statements, bills of sale, correspondence with cattle buyers in Chicago. The transactions involved sums of money that were simply staggering. One letter made her blood run cold. It was from a law firm in Helena. It discussed the management of the Webb estate. It mentioned properties beyond the ranch, holdings in town, investments in mining operations, a web of business interests that painted a picture of immense, sprawling wealth. She backed away from the desk, her heart pounding. Garrett wasn't just a successful rancher. He was wealthy. Incredibly wealthy. And he had hidden it from her. That night, by the fire, she couldn't stop staring at him. He was reading a book, looking peaceful, content. How much of this quiet, happy life was built on a lie? "Garrett," she began, her voice careful. "May I ask you something personal?" He put down his book, giving her his full attention. "Of course, you're my wife. You can ask me anything." "Why did you seek a wife through correspondence, a man of your standing? Surely you had other opportunities." A shadow passed over his face. "What makes you think I have any particular standing?" He was deflecting, answering a question with a question. "The way people treat you," she pressed gently. "The scale of this ranch. It's clear you're more than just another rancher trying to get by." He was silent for a long time, staring into the flames. "I've found that women who know about a man's financial circumstances before they know the man himself often have difficulty separating the two, he said finally. I wanted a wife who would value me for who I am, not for what I own. The words were a punch to the gut. And you thought lying to me was the best way to do that? The accusation hung between them. I never lied to you, Fiona, he said, his voice tight. I told you I was a rancher, and I am. I told you I wanted a partnership, and I do. I simply omitted certain information. Information that was relevant to my decision, she shot back. I married you, thinking I was choosing a simple life. Instead, I find myself in a world I don't understand. His face softened. He looked almost vulnerable. Are you disappointed? Was she? She was confused, overwhelmed, angry, but disappointed. I don't know what I am, she said honestly. I'm trying to understand why you couldn't trust me with the truth. It wasn't about trust, Fiona. It was about fear, he said, his voice earnest. I've seen what wealth does to people. I wanted you to know me first, before you knew about the rest of it. He leaned forward, his eyes pleading. And now I hope you'll give me a chance to explain everything, to show you that whatever else I may own, what I want most is a true partnership with you. She looked into his eyes and saw sincerity. She saw regret. But she also saw the deep chasm of his secret, a chasm that now lay between them. And she didn't know if they could ever build a bridge across it. The next morning was tense. Garrett was quiet at breakfast, a nervousness about him she'd never seen before. I need to ride out to the south pasture, he said, pushing his plate away. But when I get back this evening, I'd like to show you something. Something I should have shown you from the beginning. The gravity in his voice made her shiver. What kind of something? The truth, he said. All of it. After he left, the house felt enormous, empty. Fiona couldn't settle. She wandered from room to room, seeing everything with new eyes. The imported fabrics, the fine silver. The signs of wealth were everywhere, signs she had been too naive or too trusting to see. Her wandering led her to a door at the end of the upstairs hall, a door that was always closed. Garrett had never forbidden her from entering, but she had always sensed it was his private space. Today, she didn't care. Her hand turned the brass knob. The room was his private study, richer and more personal than the office downstairs. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling. A massive oak desk dominated the room, but it was the wall behind the desk that stole her breath. A massive oil painting hung there in a heavy, ornate gold frame. It was a family portrait, a distinguished man with Garrett's kind eyes, an elegant woman in a silk gown, and two young men. One was unmistakably a younger Garrett, the other must be his brother. But it wasn't just the painting. It was the message it sent. This wasn't a family of ranchers. This was aristocracy. The clothes, the formal poses, the background of vast lands. This was a portrait of power, of generational wealth. A small brass plate at the bottom read, "The Webb family of Montana Territory. Samuel Webb, Catherine Webb, Garrett Webb, and Jonathan Webb. 1875. Fiona sank into the leather chair behind the desk, her legs giving out. This wasn't about modest prosperity. This was about a fortune. Garrett wasn't just a wealthy rancher. He was the heir to an empire, and he had been playing the part of a simple cowboy. She looked around the room. A Persian rug, crystal decanters, leather-bound ledgers. With a trembling hand, she opened one. Columns of figures stared back at her. Properties in every major town. Investments in mines, in railroads, cattle operations that spanned 3 states. The Webb family wasn't just wealthy. They were one of the most powerful families in the entire West. Dear God, she whispered to the silent room. Who did I marry? A sound from outside snapped her out of her shock. Horses! Garrett was back, much earlier than expected. and he wasn't alone. Panic seized her. She was trespassing. She slammed the ledger shut, her shaking hands fumbling to put it back exactly where she found it. She nearly knocked over a decanter as she heard the front door open, heard Garrett call her name. She slipped out of the study, pulling the door closed just as his voice echoed up the stairs. "Fiona?" There was a note of concern in his voice when she didn't answer immediately. "Coming!" she called back, praying her voice didn't betray her. She smoothed her dress, tried to calm her racing heart, and went downstairs. He was waiting in the main room, his expression brightening when he saw her. "There you are. I was worried." "I was just tidying upstairs," she lied, the words feeling like acid on her tongue. He studied her face. "Are you all right? You look pale." "I'm fine," she said, hating the deception, hating that he had forced her into this position. "Good," he said, though he still looked concerned. "Because I've asked Buck to arrange something special for this evening, I want to show you the family cemetery." He paused, gathering his courage. "And then I want to show you the portrait of my family, and explain what it means, what all of this means." The portrait, the very painting she had just been staring at. Her cheeks burned. She would have to pretend. She would have to sit through his grand revelation and act surprised. "That sounds important," she managed to say. "It is," he said, his voice serious. "It's the most important conversation we'll ever have. It's about who I really am." He took her hands. They were warm, gentle, as always. But now his touch felt different. Complicated. "Fiona, whatever you learn tonight, I need you to know one thing. I married you because I saw a kindness and a strength in you that I've been searching for my entire life. That part has never been a lie." His sincerity was a knife in her heart. He was afraid of losing her over his lie, while she was hiding a lie of her own. "Tonight," he promised, releasing her hands. "No more secrets." As he went upstairs, Fiona stared out the window at the endless land that belonged to her husband. The man she thought she knew was a stranger. The life she thought she had was a fantasy. And she was trapped in the middle of it all, a player in a game where she didn't even know the rules. The afternoon crawled by, each tick of the clock a hammer blow against her nerves. When evening came, Garrett descended the stairs, dressed in a finely tailored dark suit. He looked every bit the powerful man she now knew him to be. He offered her his arm, and they walked in silence to a small rise overlooking the ranch, the family cemetery. The headstones were polished granite, grand and imposing. Samuel Webb, 1820-1878, Catherine Ashworth. Webb, 1825-1876. "My parents," Garrett said, his voice thick with a grief that felt raw and real. For a moment, the lies and secrets fell away. He was just a son, missing his mother and father. He told her about them, about his father, a man who came west with nothing and built an empire through grit and vision. About his mother, an educated woman who taught him that character was more important than coin. It was a story of good people who had used their wealth responsibly, but it only highlighted the immense gulf between his world and hers. Back at the house, he led her to the private study. Her heart pounded as he lit the lamps, the golden light slowly revealing the family portrait. She forced a gasp, praying it sounded genuine. "This is who I really am, Fiona," he said, watching her face. "The heir to the Webb cattle empire, one of the largest landowners in the Montana Territory." "I don't understand," she said, the lie tasting bitter. "Why would you hide this?" He turned to the window, staring out at his kingdom. "Because I learned a long time ago that wealth changes everything. Women saw a fortune, not a man. Friends saw an opportunity, not a person. I was tired of being an inheritance. I wanted to be a husband." He faced her, his expression stripped bare. "So when I decided to marry, I promised myself I would find someone who would choose me, just me, a man with a modest ranch and a good heart. Everything else was just details." "They're not details, Garrett! They're the foundation of our entire life!" she cried, the frustration and confusion boiling over. I married you thinking I was choosing one life, and I've been dropped into another. You find yourself as my wife, he said, his voice firm, pleading. Nothing else has to change. We can live simply. The money doesn't have to define us. Before she could answer, there was a frantic sound from outside. Hoofbeats, fast and urgent. Buck Henderson was riding toward the house as if the devil himself was on his tail. Garrett frowned. Something's wrong. They rushed downstairs just as Buck slid his horse to a halt, his face grim. Boss, we've got trouble, big trouble. He took a breath, his eyes finding Fiona. There's a woman in town, asking questions about Mrs. Webb, says she's her mother, and she's come to take her home. The world tilted. Fiona felt the blood drain from her face. Her mother. Here. The ghost from her past had come back to haunt her. The prison she had escaped was trying to drag her back. What kind of questions? Garrett demanded, his voice sharp as steel. Buck's face was grim. Claims her daughter was kidnapped, taken against her will by some fortune hunter. She's got the sheriff's ear, and she's talking about annulling the marriage. Says the girl wasn't of sound mind when she consented. Her knees buckled, annulled, dragged back to the criticism, the control, the slow, suffocating death of her spirit. She can't do that, Fiona whispered, but a cold dread told her that her mother was capable of anything. Actually, Garrett said, his voice dark, she might be able to. If she can convince a judge you were coerced. I'd have to go back with her, Fiona finished, the words like poison in her mouth. Not if I have anything to say about it, Garrett bit out. In that moment, he was no longer the gentle rancher. He was the master of this empire, and his eyes blazed with a fire she'd never seen. Buck, send word to my attorney in Helena. Tell him to be here at dawn, and send someone to town. I want an eye on Mrs. Sterling. I want to know every word she says, and who she says it to. As Buck rode off, Garrett turned to her, his face a mask of grim determination. Fiona, I need you to tell me everything, every cruel word, every threat, everything she might use against us. The old fear crept back in, cold and familiar. Her mother was a master manipulator. She would twist the truth until it was unrecognizable. She would paint herself as a grieving mother, and Fiona as a foolish, unstable child. She'll lie, Fiona said, her voice a hollow whisper. She can be very convincing. Then we need to be more convincing, Garrett replied. We need to show them that our marriage is based on genuine affection, not coercion, not deception. The irony was a bitter pill. Their marriage was built on a deception. His deception. And now that very secret, the one he had kept to protect himself, had become the perfect weapon for her mother to use against them. If Constance Sterling discovered who Garrett Webb really was, she wouldn't just try to annul the marriage. She would try to destroy him. They stared at each other in the lamplight, the truth of their situation crashing down around them. The battle for Fiona's freedom had just begun, and the one secret that could save them was also the one that could ruin everything. The next morning, the lawyer arrived from Helena. Theodore Whitman was a man who radiated competence and power. His presence alone was a statement. This was not some small-town dispute. This was Webb family business. Mrs. Sterling has been quite vocal, Mr. Whitman reported as they gathered in the study. She's claiming you were lured away by a fortune hunter, that you were emotionally distressed and not of sound mind. Fiona flinched, the public airing of her private pain a fresh humiliation. She's gathering support, Buck added grimly, painting herself as a poor widow trying to save her daughter from a scoundrel. Just then, another sound drifted up the road. A procession. Several riders and a wagon, moving with official purpose. Sheriff Morrison and the territorial magistrate, Whitman said, his face grim. It seems Mrs. Sterling has convinced them to investigate personally. Fiona's heart hammered against her ribs. In the wagon, a rigid figure in black sat bolt upright. Her mother, dressed for her role, the wronged party, the grieving mother. "Are you ready for this?" Garrett asked, his voice low. She looked at him, at the steely resolve in his eyes. He was no longer hiding. He was ready to fight, but the lie still hung between them. "I don't know," she whispered. "She has a way of making me feel like a child again." "You are not a child," he said firmly. "You are my wife, and this is your home." The delegation stopped in front of the house. Constance Sterling was helped down from the wagon, moving with the practiced drama of a great actress. She saw Fiona in the doorway, and her eyes, cold and sharp, locked onto her. "Fiona," she called, her voice a perfect blend of concern and wounded pride. "My poor, dear child, I've come to take you home." "This is my home, Mother," Fiona said, shocked by the strength in her own voice. "I'm married now. My place is with my husband." "Your place," Constance said, each word a carefully placed stone, "is with the family who raised you. You've been deceived by a man who took advantage of your innocence." Magistrate Coleman stepped forward, his eyes taking in the obvious wealth of the ranch. "Mr. Webb, these are serious allegations. Mrs. Sterling claims you misrepresented yourself to lure her daughter into marriage." And there it was. The great, terrible irony. Her mother thought Garrett was a poor man pretending to be rich. The truth was so much more complicated, and so much more dangerous. "I would like to hear these allegations in detail," Garrett said calmly, every inch the master of his domain. "And my wife and I will respond to them. We have nothing to hide." As they moved into the house to begin the hearing, Fiona knew her entire future hung in the balance. It wasn't just about the law. It was about her. It was about finding the strength to finally, once and for all, stand up to the woman who had tried to erase her. The main room was transformed into a courtroom. Magistrate Coleman sat behind the heavy oak table, his face stern. Constance sat opposite, the picture of maternal suffering. "Mrs. Sterling," the magistrate began, "please state your allegations." Constance rose, a black-clad pillar of righteous grief. "Your Honor, my daughter has been the victim of a calculated deception. This man, this fortune hunter, lured her away from her home with false promises and married her before she could understand the trap he had set." Every word was a lie wrapped in a sliver of truth. It was her mother's specialty. "Furthermore," Constance continued, her voice trembling with practiced emotion, "my daughter has been unwell since her father's death. She is fragile, easily led. She was not in a position to give sound consent." Constance's lawyer stepped forward. "Your Honor, we have evidence that Mr. Webb specifically sought out women from struggling families, presenting himself as a humble rancher. It is a clear pattern of predation." They were twisting everything. The very qualities that had drawn her to Garrett, his kindness, his supposed simplicity, were now being used as weapons against them. "Mr. Webb," the magistrate said, turning his stern gaze on Garrett, "how do you respond?" Garrett stood, his presence filling the room. "Your Honor, I can provide our correspondence and testimony from Reverend Morrison. At no point did I misrepresent my intentions." "But you did conceal the extent of your wealth," Constance's lawyer pounced. "You pretended to be a simple rancher, when in fact you are one of the richest men in the territory." A stunned silence fell over the room. The sheriff's jaw dropped. Magistrate Coleman leaned forward, his eyes wide. "Mr. Webb," he said slowly, "is this allegation accurate?" Garrett met his gaze without flinching. "I am the heir to the Webb cattle empire, yes. And I did not volunteer that information to Mrs. Webb." "There!" Constance shrieked, triumphant. "He admits it! Deception!" Actually, Garrett's attorney interjected smoothly, my client's wealth makes these allegations absurd. Why would a man of his means need to deceive a young woman into marriage? If anything, his desire for anonymity proves his motives were genuine. It was a dizzying legal battle, a whirlwind of accusations and defenses, and Fiona sat in the middle of it, a silent pawn in a game for her own life. They talked about her as if she wasn't there. They debated her mind, her choices, her very soul. Enough. The word was quiet, but it cut through the room like a blade. Enough, she said again, rising to her feet. Every eye turned to her. I would like to speak for myself. Magistrate Coleman nodded. Mrs. Webb, you may. Fiona stepped forward, her heart pounding, but her voice was a steel rod. Your Honor, I am 28 years old. I am not a fragile child. I am not a naive victim. You don't understand, dear. Constance cooed, her voice dripping with false sympathy. You've always been too trusting. I understand perfectly, Fiona said, turning to face her mother. The moment had come. I understand that for 8 years I lived under your control. I understand that you convinced me I was weak because you needed someone to blame for your own unhappiness. Constance's face flushed a deep, ugly red. How dare you? You sacrificed nothing for me, Fiona continued, her voice gaining strength. You used me. You destroyed every chance I had for happiness because you couldn't bear to see me have what you had lost. The room was dead silent. This was no longer a legal hearing. It was an exorcism. I married Garrett Webb because I chose to, Fiona said, turning back to the magistrate. Because I saw in him a kindness and respect I had never known. Yes, he hid his wealth. But he did it to find a woman who would love the man, not the money. That is not deception. That is a man with a heart. She took a deep breath and faced her mother one last time. The fear was gone. In its place was a calm, cold certainty. I will not be returning to your house, Mother. I will not live in the shadow of your bitterness any longer. I am married to a good man, and no court, no magistrate, and certainly not you, will ever change that. Her words hung in the air. A final, unbreakable declaration of independence. Magistrate Coleman stared at Fiona, then at the sputtering, furious Constance. He cleared his throat. In light of Mrs. Webb's clear and competent testimony, and the unusual circumstances of the allegations, I find no grounds to question the legality of this marriage. He banged a hand on the table. Case dismissed. It was over. Constance stared, her mouth opening and closing like a fish, utterly defeated. The power she had wielded for so long had crumbled to dust. As the sheriff and the magistrate prepared to leave, a smug smile crossed Constance's face. You think you've won? She sneered, her voice low and venomous. You know nothing. You've married into a family of liars and thieves. That's enough, Mrs. Sterling, the sheriff warned. But Constance ignored him. She looked directly at Garrett. Ask him about his brother, Fiona. Ask him about Jonathan. The name from the portrait. Garrett's face went white. Ask him why the precious Webb family portrait is missing its eldest son. Ask him what really happened to the true heir of the Webb fortune. It was another bomb dropped into the room. Fiona stared at Garrett, a new, cold dread seeping into her veins. What was she talking about? What new secret was about to unravel? The magistrate paused at the door, his interest piqued once again. What happened to Jonathan Webb? Constance asked, her voice a triumphant song. Garrett here had him committed, locked away in an asylum, all to steal his inheritance. The accusation was monstrous. Fiona felt the floor drop out from under her. She looked at Garrett, pleading with her eyes for him to deny it. But he couldn't. The silence was his confession. His carefully constructed world, His story of honor and integrity, it was all crashing down. He hadn't just lied about his money. He had lied about everything. "It's not what you think," Garrett said, his voice strained. But it was too late. The damage was done. Her mother had lost the legal battle, but she had won the war. She had planted a seed of doubt so poisonous it threatened to destroy everything. As Constance was escorted out, a final, victorious smirk on her face, Fiona was left alone with her husband. A man who was, once again, a complete stranger. A man who may have betrayed his own brother for the empire he now controlled. The victory felt hollow, a bitter ash in her mouth. She had won her freedom from one prison, only to find herself trapped in another, a grand house filled with secrets, lies, and the ghost of a betrayed brother. That night, the house was silent, but the space between Fiona and Garrett screamed with unspoken questions. He tried to explain. He told her Jonathan was unstable, reckless, a danger to himself and the family. He said committing him was the hardest thing he'd ever done, a choice made from love, not greed. But how could she believe him? He had lied before. "I need time," she said, retreating to her room, the one he had so thoughtfully given her for privacy. Now it felt like a cell. For days, they lived as ghosts in the grand house, polite strangers sharing meals in silence. Fiona's heart was a battlefield of warring emotions. The kindness he showed her every day fought against the monstrous secret he had kept. Was he a good man forced to make a terrible choice? Or a ruthless predator who had deceived her as easily as he had his own brother? One afternoon, Buck found her in the garden. The old foreman's face was etched with worry. "Ma'am," he began, twisting his hat in his hands. "I've known Garrett his whole life. What his mother said, it ain't the whole story." He told her about Jonathan, a charming but wild young man, a gambler, a drinker, a man who brought shame and debt to the family name. He told her about the night Jonathan, in a drunken rage, had set fire to a barn, nearly killing 2 ranch hands. "Garrett didn't do it for the money, ma'am," Buck said, his voice thick with emotion. "He did it to save his brother from the gallows. The asylum was the only way to keep him from destroying himself, and everyone around him." A new piece of the puzzle, a piece that changed the picture entirely. That night, she found Garrett in the study, staring at the family portrait. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked, her voice soft. "I was ashamed," he admitted, his back still to her. "It's the great failure of my life. I couldn't save him." "You did save him, Garrett," she said, moving to stand beside him. He finally turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a pain so deep it made her ache. From the gallows, at least. In that moment, she saw the truth. The burden he carried, the weight of his family, his fortune, and his brother's tragic life. She reached out and took his hand. "No more secrets," she whispered. "No more," he agreed, his hand tightening around hers. It was a beginning. A fragile, tentative step across the chasm of lies that had separated them. But their peace was short-lived. A week later, a letter arrived. The paper was cheap, the handwriting erratic. It was from the asylum, and it was from Jonathan. "Brother," it read, "I hear you've taken a wife. A pretty little thing from nothing, I'm told. Does she know what you are? Does she know how you stole my life? I'm getting out, Garrett, and when I do, I'm coming to take back what's mine, starting with your new bride." The threat was a cold slap. Jonathan wasn't just a sad story from the past. He was a clear and present danger, and he was coming for her. Panic seized Fiona. Garrett tried to reassure her, telling her Jonathan was secure, that his threats were empty. But 2 nights later, she was woken by a sound from downstairs. A floorboard creaking. The house was supposed to be silent, locked up tight. Garrett was asleep beside her. She slipped out of bed, her heart pounding. She crept to the top of the stairs and peered down into the darkness. A figure was moving in the shadows of the main room. A man. He lit a match, and in the brief, flickering light, she saw his face. It was the face from the portrait. Wild, handsome, but twisted with a manic energy. Jonathan. He hadn't waited. He was already here. Before she could scream, a hand clamped over her mouth from behind. A second man. He'd come in through the back. She was trapped. Jonathan looked up, a cruel smile spreading across his face as he saw her, held captive by his accomplice. "Hello, sister," he sneered. "Time to pay your husband's debts." They dragged her down the stairs, her feet barely touching the ground. Jonathan's eyes were fever-bright, terrifying. He grabbed a lantern, his movements jerky and unpredictable. "We're going to have a little bonfire," he said, his voice a giddy whisper. "Just like old times." He started splashing lantern oil on the expensive furniture, on the curtains, on the beautiful wooden floors. The accomplice held Fiona tight, his grip like iron. She struggled, but it was useless. Just as Jonathan was about to light another match, a gunshot exploded through the house. The accomplice grunted, his grip loosening as he crumpled to the floor. Garrett stood at the top of the stairs, a pistol in his hand, his face a mask of cold fury. "Let her go, Jonathan," he said, his voice dangerously calm. Jonathan just laughed, a high, unhinged sound. He grabbed Fiona, pulling her in front of him as a shield. He held the lit match over a pool of oil. "You should have let me hang, brother," he hissed. "It would have been kinder." He dropped the match. The room erupted in flames. Garrett fired again, the bullet grazing Jonathan's arm, forcing him to release Fiona. She scrambled away as Garrett rushed down the stairs through the smoke and heat. Jonathan, howling in rage and pain, disappeared into the fiery chaos. Garrett grabbed Fiona, pulling her toward the back of the house as the fire roared, consuming everything they had built together. They burst out into the cold night air, coughing, gasping for breath, and watched as their home was swallowed by a vortex of fire. The empire of stone and timber was turning to ash, but they were alive. They were together. Standing in the cold moonlight, wrapped in Garrett's arms, Fiona watched the flames lick the sky. The house, the money, the portrait. It was all gone, and in a strange way, she felt a sense of relief. The fire had burned away the secrets. It had burned away the lies. All that was left was them. Two people who had found each other through a web of deception, who had fought for each other, and who had survived. The Webb Empire wasn't the land or the cattle or the house. It was them. And from these ashes, they would build a new one, together. A life built not on a hidden fortune, but on a truth that had been forged in fire. If this story of survival and second chances moved you, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because what I have for you tomorrow is a tale of justice you won't want to miss.